Now, Labour MP Clive Lewis has called for the government to engage in meaningful negotiations with the Caribbean over Britain paying reparations for the transatlantic slave trade. Well, Lewis likened the relationship between the UK and the Commonwealth to an abusive relationship in which one partner has endured 400 years of the most hideous abuse, one who now seeks charity, not charity, but restitution. So, should Britain pay reparations to its former colonies? Joining me now is Dr Zarir Masani, historian of the British Empire, and Martin Whittock, who is a historian and licensed lay minister for the Church of England. I've been asking for emails on this as well. We'll go to those shortly. Should we be paying reparations for the slave trade? Dr Zarir, I will bring you in now. Do you think that Clive Lewis is right and that the British taxpayer owes various Caribbean nations a boatload of cash?
No, I don't think so at all. I think it's a complete nonsense to be talking about reparations for something that happened 200 or 300 years ago. The descendants of the victims of that time, we cannot definitely ascertain simply by paying a government in the Caribbean. We have no idea where those reparations are going to end up. Also, who's going to pay those reparations? And are we going to deduct from those reparations the enormous costs to the British Navy of policing the abolition of slavery across the world, not only the Britain's trade, but which came to about 2% of national income at its average height? And the question then is also who pays these reparations. So if the British taxpayer is going to pay them, you will have, firstly, the descendants of slaves themselves, who are British taxpayers now, black British people, will be paying the same taxes for those reparations. And also the vast majority of British people who are descended from factory workers, farm workers, etc., whose conditions were very little better than slaves. In fact, in some cases, worse. So this whole idea of this restitution culture, I think, is a bit of a nonsense. We need to address modern slavery today and put our resources into that. And whatever resources are available should go into that. You know, 9 million people in Africa today are in modern-day slavery.
Yes, OK. Martin, I'll bring you in on this, as we've just been hearing there. I mean, the British, of course, did also play a significant role in ending the slave trade. And, frankly, a lot of people alive today, like myself, you could trace my family tree back as far as you like, had absolutely nothing to do with the slave trade. So why should British taxpayers today be made to fork out?
Because I think the whole British community in the 19th century was enriched by the slave trade. Britain received 2 centuries of unpaid labour from over 15 million African slaves in the Caribbean. The wealth generated by this came to about 11% of the British economy in the early 19th century, and which was built on that, billions of pounds. But also, in order to compensate slave owners when slaves were freed, the UK government in 1833 paid them somewhere in the region of £17 billion in today's values. And so huge was the loan taken by the government to pay off the slave owners, and I think people who are listening and viewing this will be shocked to discover that it wasn't paid off until 2015. It was only in 2015 that the UK taxpayer stopped paying the modern creditors and investment houses who'd inherited the loans and consequently benefited from that payment made in the 1830s. Billions and billions of pounds, and not a penny went to the slaves or their descendants. And if it's not going to be the UK government, then somebody, in my opinion, needs to be paying. There's a Latin legal phrase that says, "Cui bono?" Who gains from it? Well, some families and some institutions made a mint out of slavery. My opinion is, follow the money, someone needs to pay.
All right, Dr Zarir, come back to that, please.
Well, this idea that this is sort of guilt money that is going to be paid from people who were not responsible for what happened. You know, we hear about the costs of compensating owners. What this gentleman forgets is that thousands of owners were not big slave owners. They were not big corporate houses. They were little old ladies living in Cheltenham whose pension was being paid for by owning half a slave or a slave. Now, they had to be compensated, and it was done at a time when private property was considered sacrosanct. The only way of abolishing slavery was by buying out the slave owners. And slave ownership wasn't just a Western European phenomenon, it was a global phenomenon, which the British helped stamp out across the British Empire. It was carried on in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in China, in India, where I come from, right into the late 19th, early 20th century.
OK. How far back do we go, Martin? Because if we're going to all fork out for reparations, shouldn't people who are descendants of the Ottoman Empire also fork out from it? What about, of course, people in Africa who were responsible for the slave trade as well? Why is it us?
Well, I have no doubt that the responsibility of this is wider than us. But the simple matter is, I'm British, and I want to take moral responsibility for my share of it.
What would you pay?
Sorry?
What would you pay?
What would I pay? Well, obviously, I would pay a significant amount. I mean, I would be prepared to pay a chunk of my taxes to people in the Caribbean and communities that are still struggling. Yes, I would.
How much?
I've never voted to cut my taxes because I think there are so many things that are so important. I would be prepared to pay for this. Yeah, I would.
Well, why don't you just donate money?
And would you give a discount to black British people?
Well, I think this is a debate we have to have, but I think simply saying no is inappropriate. And I think the British economy as a whole and British society as a whole has gained from it. Any of us living now today in Britain, black or white, whoever we are living in a society that has benefited hugely from the wealth generated by the slave trade. And I think we have a moral responsibility to engage with Caribbean states to try to do something about that. I'm not saying it's the only problem facing the Caribbean, but I think our heritage is there in the mix. And I would be prepared to start engaging with that moral question. Yes, I would. And it might cost me. Yes, it would.
OK, I'm just going to ask, Martin, because this is something you clearly feel very passionate about. Why on earth you've not done it earlier?
Sorry? Well, I think like many people, I have been grossly ignorant. I think that many people, I've been locked into, the pressures of today, the issues of the moment. And it literally is only in the last 4 or 5 years that I have looked at this myself seriously and realised that until 2015, we were paying off slave owners, but we wouldn't pay a penny to the descendants of slaves. So, yeah, I put my hands up. I should have done something about this a long time ago. But I think better late than never is my feeling on this.
Dr. Zaria, how do you respond to that claim that we have all benefited massively as a society as a result of the slave trade and therefore we now owe people something?
We have all benefited globally, not just as British people, but as Indian people like me, who have benefited all over the world from slavery all over the world. The transatlantic slave trade was a relatively small part of slavery all over the world. There were huge slave markets all over Africa, the Middle East. Some of the biggest beneficiaries of slave ownership are Nigerian millionaires. Now, I think unless there is some kind of global strategy of compensation, it makes no sense for Britain, which took the lead in abolition globally, which incurred huge costs, 2% of national income, half the naval budget, from the 1830s and 40s, I think Britain has the least need to be paying for this.
OK. I'm going to ask you about this now, Martin, in the sense of there's a decent point there, which is that the reason why the slave trade could predominantly exist was because there were people at source, as it were, who were prepared, of course, to go and round people up and put them into slavery, and those people became very rich off it. So, with respect, are you going to go around to certain countries like the one Nigeria was mentioned there and try and approach a Nigerian billionaire and try and get the money off him?
There's no doubt about it, and as the previous guest has just said, that the web of slavery spreads far and wide, and I absolutely accept that. I understand that.
And including, by the way, just to say, including, are we also going to go over to several Muslim countries who did enslave white Europeans as well? Because if we are, then it's just a game of back and forth, and you could argue there's absolutely no point anyone getting involved in it, Martin.
I understand the point you're making. All I'm saying is that I think the damage that was done to the Caribbean is still lived damage today. I think the problems of the Caribbean is very much a lived problem today. And I think we as a nation played a part in that. And I can't take responsibility for other people's countries. I can only take responsibility for mine. And I feel that I have a moral responsibility to do something about this. And others must make their own positions clear. But I think as a British person, I think I do have a moral position on here. I know it's complicated, but I think there are things things going on today that are the products of things that my ancestors did not that long ago. I mean, we're talking about 200 years ago, and maybe I have responsibility.
Did they, though? Because my ancestors didn't, and I don't fancy paying a penny, to be honest with you. So did your ancestors directly do anything involved in the slave trade, Martin?
No, they didn't.
Right.
But they smoked tobacco. They used sugar. They maybe worked in the port of Bristol. In other words, the whole of the British economy benefited hundreds of thousands of people. It wasn't just plantation owners. So the answer is, my family didn't directly. Nope. But I, as a British person, benefited. Yep, because we all did. We all do.
Dr. Zarir, I take it you're not inclined to part with any of your cash?
I'm not, because I don't see it doing any good. I don't think the problems of the Caribbean today, such as they are, have anything to do with slavery. I think they're to do with problems of governance, of economic opportunity, etc. in the Caribbean. And I don't think a handout from Britain is going to make any difference to that. And I don't think it addresses the problem of modern-day global slavery and the kind of web which your guest accepts, accepted across the world. I don't see how that is going to be addressed. And also the fact that a lot of people in Britain, white British people, were horribly exploited, were not beneficiaries of slavery, did not benefit from the profits of sugar or tobacco or any of those things, worked incredible hours in factories, up chimneys, etc. Are those people going to get compensation for capitalist exploitation? Where would this end?